Again, my name is Brett Bodie. I'm talking on behalf, actually, of the whole NCSA and Blue Waters team on research on blue waters. Just a little bit of history of blue waters. For those of you, most of you probably have heard of it since it's been around quite a few years now, but I'll just give a little bit of an overview. Blue waters was actually awarded as part of an NSF proposal for a leadership computing system way back in 2007. It was envisioned to be somewhat of a co-design process. So for the first 4 or so years, it was more of a co-design, working with applications on our side, working to optimize them for the ultimate hardware that was planned to be delivered. There was a few hiccups in there that I'll leave out. It's better for other discussion, and we ended up building and deploying a large Cray XE/XK system in 2012 that was accepted in late 2012 and went into full service operations in the beginning of Q2 of 2013, and those full service operations continue today. They're planned to end on December 19th of this year, so that's about 6.5 years of full service, which is not bad for a large system. As we'll see later, we're actually planning to run it even a little bit longer, so I'll talk a little bit about that later. Blue Waters is the largest XE/XK system and actually the largest by certainly cabinet count of any Cray system that Cray has ever built. It's roughly a 13 petaflop peak system with about 1.6 petabytes of RAM. We combine that with an ecosystem including 26 petabytes of high-speed storage, 300 petabytes of capacity in a tape system, and a high-speed network capability of over 400 gigabits per second. Just a few other numbers on numbers of merit. So it's a hybrid system, so we have both XE nodes, which are dual socket AMD Interlagos nodes, and XK nodes, which sacrifice one of the AMD Interlagos sockets for an NVIDIA Kepler K20X GPU. So we have 22,636 XE nodes and 4,228 XK nodes. So a very large system, very large CPU capability, as well as a fairly good size GPU capability. That was combined, and I didn't mention it in here, but that was combined with a 1 terabyte per second I/O capability onto the spinning disk storage. The project involved more than, of course, just the system. We had a number of different programs that went around that. We have a very large application support team that did things very much in the vein of the DOE's Insight program and other programs of that nature, where we worked with science teams heavily to optimize their codes for the system and make sure they get the most out of it. We also had a application improvement program where we actually paid both science teams and improvement enablers, which typically were vendors such as NVIDIA or HDF Group or others, to work together to target different aspects of optimizing their code or developing new capabilities within their code. We also had a consortium around the program with the Great Lakes Computing Consortium for Pedescale Computing that involved universities and organizations, and particularly in the upper Midwest, but actually ended up being much more broad-based than that, and used that to help broaden the reach of the system and encourage new capabilities to come onto the system. That also included we built a building basically for Blue Waters that will continue on well beyond the life of Blue Waters, capable of something on the order of 24 megawatts of usable power, of course cooling as well to match that, and it's a very flexible facility supporting both air cooling and direct liquid water cooling. Just a few other things of merit here. So one thing to note is because it has been around for so long, we have produced a lot of node hours for science. So we've delivered over 1.3 billion node hours for computational science in the open science community. It's more or less equivalent to 441 billion core hour equivalents. As I mentioned before, it's the largest Cray system that was ever built, and certainly the largest 3D torus. We did a lot of work to make that torus work well. So we did do topology aware scheduling. So we optimize the placement of particularly large tasks in the system to be in a regular cuboid shape rather than being sprinkled around the torus, as is the default for most systems of its type. So it has a lot of capabilities. It is a mature system at this point, so it is running well though, and we're getting a lot of science use out of it. So that does give me a lot of choice as to what to put for science accomplishments. So these are some of my selections. I pulled out of slides that have been prepared over the last 5 or 6 years. So some of them are fresher than others, but I think all have some measure of merit. So certainly when we started Blue Waters, we were very focused on the traditional simulation areas, so molecular sciences. NAMD was one of our go-to codes, of course, because it's developed at the University of Illinois. But we also had a lot of other areas, from weather and climate forecasting to the earth sciences and health sciences, a lot of astro, that sort of thing. So for example, Paul Woodward is very much a usual suspect in this community. His PPM code does a lot of has been used for a long time, and I think as he says, he's been optimizing his code for the last 30 years, so, and he continues to do so. On Blue Waters, he was able to sustain 1.5 petaflops in some early runs using 21,000 or almost 22,000 XE nodes, so near full XE system sort of runs there, writing over 1 petabyte during those runs. So quite impressive runs even today. Also another researcher, Homo Karamabadi from UCSD, did work on space weather, looking at how particles from solar flares interact with the Earth's magnetosphere. And these were independent research projects that happened to be done on the system in a similar time frame. One of the things I'll talk about later is one of the aspects of the program and capabilities of NCSA are to take projects that are done in a very researchy vein and communicate them to the general public in ways that make them accessible, hopefully, to the general public. This particular work, the Karamabadi work and the Woodward work, were combined into a dome show by our Advanced Visualization Laboratory, among others, and that dome show is now running in domes still running in dome shows and planetariums around the country. It's a dome show called Solar Superstorms. And it's a fairly highly produced show, including narration by Benedict Cumberbatch. So they do fairly good work. Another example, of course, of work on the system is looking at, it was done very early on, was looking at the simulation of the HIV capsid. This was work done by Klaus Schulten's team at the University of Illinois. The Schulten team, of course, are responsible for the NAMD code that's used widely around the world. And they produced some seminal works early on in Blue Waters by moving the state-of-the-art forward to be able to do much larger and longer timescales on these capsids. That resulted in a Cover of Nature article way back in 2013, and they followed it up with some other work that resulted in additional Nature covers in subsequent years. Another project that's been on the system for many years is earthquake science. The SCEC, Southern California Earthquake Center, has had time on Blue Waters for much of the time that Blue Waters has been operating. Tom Jordan and Phil Makeling and more recently John Vidal have been PIs on the effort to enhance the capability of their resolution and time periods that they can do for both Southern California, but now they're moving beyond Southern California and to other regions of the state and around the country. We have another PI named Don Wubels, who does a lot of climate work in collaboration with others around the country, including collaborators at NCAR and University of Maryland, and on Blue Waters was used to enhance, again, the resolution and the time periods that could be dealt with within their codes. Some of the work that they did on Blue Waters, for example, was to look at projected changes in tropical cyclones as a result of climate change, climate warming over time. Another weather-related study is NCSA has kind of been associated with tornado simulation for many years. Actually, one of the images that's been around for NCSA for probably much of its 30-year history has been worked by the Wilhelmsen and more recently the Orff teams. Bob Wilhelmsen was a long-time University of Illinois professor looking at NCSA collaborator who did tornado simulations. More recently, Lee Orff is carrying on his work. Lee is at the University of Wisconsin, looking at how tornadoes form, how they grow, and how they evolve over time. This work has had small allocations for much of Blue Water's lifetime. It actually has a very large allocation now, where Lee is using 19,000 node runs to simulate the highest resolution look at tornadoes to date. Another large-scale simulation was done. This was as much a proof of concept as anything else, was a study of strong scaling of reservoir simulation. So this run was again one of the largest to date when it was made. They used a relatively small number of node hours, but they were running at nearly full scale on the XE system. So about 21,000 nodes were used to strong scale this reservoir simulation to beyond what had ever been done before. Now I'm going to move forward a little bit. So each year, for the past several years, we've collected all the projects from that project year and did two-page, had the principal investigators send us two-page write-ups that are hopefully accessible to the general public. I say hopefully because some PIs are much better than others about actually understanding what that means. So we digest those and put out a book of accomplishments. And for 2018, which is the most recent year that's complete, we had 141 projects that were in that, roughly broken down in the following areas where, about 25% to space science, 25% to biology, chemistry and health, a little over a third to physics and engineering, and you see smaller allocations for geosciences, computer engineering, and others. So those are also broken down into categories by what types of science or what types of problems they have to run the system. So you can see that close to a half identify as data intensive or a very large scale, 1,000 node sort of simulations. Again, multiphysics, multi-scale is also very large. But one that has been changing over time is the number of GPU accelerated codes has risen significantly. SCET codes are an example of that, where they started out pretty much solely on the CPUs, and the last runs that they've been doing have been all pretty much GPU accelerated. Machine learning, of course, was a non-existent back in 2013 when we started, and while it's not a huge portion of our time now, it still is growing quite quickly, and we have a number of projects that are using machine learning in some form. So one of those projects is this example. It's not a huge project, but it's looking at using machine learning to construct a knowledge base of and to use for hypothesis generation for looking at antibiotic resistance in the E. coli bacteria. So again, this team is using machine learning as a research tool to see if they can gain insights into this process. Another project that is a little more out there for most of us is looking at the computational study of rezoning and in particular looking at redistricting when it comes to political maps, and particularly in the US that has to do with congressional maps. This actually resulted in Blue Waters being called out in a congressional or in a court opinion that was put out in May, roughly last May. Some of you, if you're in the U.S., may have heard of this judgment where a district court in Ohio threw out the Ohio congressional map based on excessive gerrymandering. Fortunately, Blue Waters was neither the defendant nor the plaintiff in that particular court case, but it was used by Wendy in her expert opinion. She has developed methods that help categorize maps as either being fair or within the bounds of fairness in a way that's numerical and probabilistic rather than just an opinion. So this is one of the bars set by the Supreme Court to determine whether a map is excessively gerrymandered is there has to be some sort of unbiased way to determine that rather than just looking at it. Wendy's tools have been used in that court opinion, and were actually called out specifically in that court opinion as contributing to the that ruling. More traditional codes, so Tizia Di Matteo does her Blue Tides code, does simulations of galaxies for the first 700 million years or so of cosmic evolution. She is running on the Blue Water system again now. She is again a code that runs at very high scale, so her runs are typically in the neighborhood of 20,000 nodes on the system. So even though she doesn't have a huge number of node hours, she has to meter those out very carefully, because she runs very large simulations and chews through node hours very quickly. We also have had past several years a graduate fellow program where we ask for submissions, and we provide both a financial stipend as well as time on Blue Waters for particularly emerging research areas for graduate students. Salome Cooke was one of those students looking at in the geosciences area, where she is developing numerical models and computationally studying how sediments move around and are affected by tides in estuaries. So something a little unusual. Larissa Reams is another graduate fellow, also in the geosciences area, looking at how urban areas impact the formation and paths of tornadoes and other severe weather events. Paul Fisher, University of Illinois professor, looks at turbulence in fluid flows, both on biofilms and in jets into tanks of materials, so more of a industrial type of allocation. Elizabeth Agee is developing numerical methods of simulating how root systems in trees uptake water, and as a result being able to look at how forests are drought can be either are or not drought resistant to different types of stresses. Sam Tor Iike from Stanford looks at magnetic recognition in laser-different plasmas. He was also a graduate fellow in 2015-2016. So Harada is a computational chemist. He uses computational chemistry tools to look at precision molecular optoelectronic structures, and has done a number of allocations over time in Blue Waters. Jennifer Corcoran is one of our GLCPC allocations from our Great Lakes Consortium. Her research was to take multispectral satellite imagery and compute and determine a vegetative elevation ecosystem model for the Great Lakes Basin. So not only doing an elevation map, but then layering on top of that what the vegetation is throughout that mapping system. Luda Maynes does a lot of genomic research on Blue Waters, and this particular one was looking at missing variants in Alzheimer's disease, how genetics play a role in that disease. Ellie Huerta, also at the University of Illinois, is applying deep learning methods to the LIGO project. So for those of you that don't know, LIGO is the project that has detectors in Washington and Louisiana and detected the collision of black holes and that sort of thing. So they're looking at very small signals or very weak signals in a noisy regime. The deep learning methods here have been proven by their team to be able to detect and pull out much weaker signals than traditional methods. So signals that have much lower or poorer signal to noise ratio. So they found this to be a very useful technique and are applying it now in production for some of the LIGO data analysis. From our talk on Monday night, I thought I'd throw this one in there. So Kathryn Hough does simulations of molten salt nuclear reactors on Blue Waters. And Brad Sutton looks at HPC-based quantitative MRI studies. Also on Blue Waters. So then finally I'll talk a little bit more about Paul Moran's work. So Paul's work started out as actually an investigative innovative allocation, a small-scale allocation just to kick the tires on Blue Waters, and has grown into one of our largest projects over the whole course of Blue Waters. So in 2018, he used nearly 10 million node hours. And his work basically takes stereoscopic satellite image data and computes digital elevation maps from that. So what he has done so far, and did through 2018, was to complete 2-meter resolution digital elevation maps for the entire Arctic and Antarctic regions. That means that there are now available higher resolution digital elevation maps for the poles than there are for many parts of the continental United States, including even parts of Illinois. So he is working now to change that. He has now moved on to the rest of the world, so to speak. So I'll talk in a minute about what his future plans are. But this is a novel method that has really opened up the ability to do digital mapping on a wide scale. One of Paul's claims is that based on the costs involved, that his methods are something on the order of 30,000 times cheaper to produce these maps than traditional methods. So we did have that includes the 2018 research areas. We did have a 9-month extension for NSF, and NSF allocated that in a large chunk. A smaller number of projects, but larger in size. So these allocations had to be used in only 9 months of time. So they needed to be large and ready to run. So some of the examples there are space physics with Manuela Campanelli and Adam Burrows, each of about 15 to 16 million node hours. QCD for 14 million node hours. As I mentioned before, Lior's tornado simulations or for 21 million node hour allocation. So he's running now at something on the order of 19,000 nodes at a time. So he is able to burn through that in a reasonable amount of time. And others are using NAMD for marine aerosol partitioning, looking at how the brain is wired, as well as Paul Moran's DEM production work, which has 25 million node hours in this 9 months. So mostly to move on to the rest of the Earth and produce 2-meter resolution, and then following on with half-meter resolution digital elevation maps for the entire globe. So all of these stories are available at on our website, our portal. We also produce impact stories on some teams, and as I mentioned before, we do full dome shows and that sort of thing for a number of subsets. So the solar superstorms is the one I mentioned. We also contributed to the birth of planet Earth, super tornadoes, and some others there. We have one that's in progress now called Atlas of a Changing Earth, looking at different mapping sorts of projects. So I mentioned that Blue Waters isn't quite done yet. So you may have seen recently that we announced that Blue Waters will actually continue to operate through 2020 through funding provided by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Trouble saying that. So NGA is funding us primarily to do DEM production work that Paul Moran and the Polar Center will be doing, but also work on other projects that are of interest to NGA. Now, some of you may be wondering that's going to put us running the system in production for over 7 years, or is it really capable of doing that? So we think so. The reliability of Blue Waters remains excellent, much better than actually some of our similar systems that were installed in a similar time frame. I see Al nodding back there. So particularly, he might note the GPU failure rate is actually quite good. So last year it was higher than it had been when we lost 30 GPUs out of 4,000. I think Al is envious of that sort of ratio. So our node failure rate is about 2 nodes a day, which I don't know, for those of you that have small systems, that might sound like a lot, but for a system the size of Blue Waters, that's excellent. And it's been pretty constant throughout the 6+ years that we've had Blue Waters up. That gives a mean time between failure for a node is something like 83 years. Our GPU failure rate we're watching it, but it's so far is not a problem. They're still quite reliable for us. The other one we're also quite worried about, of course, is hard drives. We've had our 17,000 2-terabyte hard drives spinning now for close to 7 years. So we are watching the failure rates, but right now they're very stable. We lose about 3 drives a week. and that's less than 1% a year and is quite an acceptable failure rate. So as long as they remain stable, we're optimistic that we can keep going. So how long, we don't know, but for a little bit longer. So in the NGA phase of operations, 90% of Blue Waters will be focused on projects of interest to NGA. We'll also have staff, as we have before, to support optimization and workflows. The allocation process is something we're still finalizing, but it looks like it will be a lightweight 2 to 5 page process submission where we will do those with input from ourselves and a steering committee, including members of the of NGA and others. So details on that will be coming hopefully by the end of the month, so we can get projects on the system by the time the NGA phase starts. In scope in general will be, like I said, things that are of interest to NGA. That particularly includes things that are related to mapping and modeling of the Earth. The majority of time will go to DEM production, but there should be time for other things, and including education projects in general. We plan to continue. And with that, I will conclude and acknowledge both the funding from NSF and other agencies, and of course note that this was not just me. There's a large team effort here, not only from the NCSA team, it's pictured there, but also our Crate site team has been very good partners with us throughout the time period of Blue Waters operations. So, thank you.
Thanks, Brett. Okay, any questions?
So when you have a node fail, can you transfer the workload to another node on the fly? Can you bring the job down gracefully, or do you and be able to restart it, or do you just lose it?
So that depends on the job. For the most part, we don't. Well, transferring to another node is basically not done. So usually that means whatever is running on that node will end. We do have had the capability throughout the lifetime of Blue Waters that an application can specify their fault tolerant and wish to handle it within the application. If they're something like NAMD that uses Charm++, that's a possibility for what you might call a self-healing application. So it doesn't stop; it just loses a node and reassigns work. That's still somewhat rare even today. More commonly, we've enabled tools that, like for MPI jobs, the MPI is going to pull the rug out from under them, right? And they're going to quit. But we do have fast restarts. So instead of the equivalent of MPI run exiting, it immediately re-kicks the application back off. Using what we tell people to do is add a node or two to your allocation, so that if a node fails, you've got a spare node that you can immediately start back up with, and that allows them to kick the application back off without going back in the queue. So the job itself doesn't end, job script doesn't exit. It just the app run actually just kicks the application back off and tries again, and the application therefore has to handle the restart. But it's a fast restart, so they don't lose a lot of time waiting in the queue again, that sort of thing.
Talked a little bit about the hardware and longevity. I'm curious about the software. So do you run the same operating system for the last 6 years?
Well, not for the last 6 years, but the thing that makes us feel the oldest probably is the operating system at this point. So we are, Cray's last supported operating system on the XEXK is SLUS 11 SP3 base, which is quite old. So that works okay for many of the simulation codes, but we do have a large amount of effort that went into getting Python codes on the system, your TensorFlow and that sort of thing aren't supported by the native Python, that sort of thing. So we do have an effort to get those on the system in a optimized way, but we also support containers, mostly through Shifter. For those of you who aren't familiar, it's very similar to Singularity, to provide container support and let users run much newer user space based things.
Follow-on question is, how do you get people on the new software packages? But that helps.
Getting them on the new is not really a challenge. Getting them to not demand the new is the challenge, right? So I mean, everybody I don't know how, I'm guessing this is pretty much universally true that when you're talking about machine learning people, everyone wants the very latest version of TensorFlow, and the version that was out last week isn't good enough, right? So it's that's currently, I think, the biggest challenge.
Have you run into any problems where you can't get the hardware anymore? I mean, after 6 years, sometimes it's just not even built.
Well, I think a year ago that might have been a little more of an issue, but guess what? There's a ton of well broken in parts that are coming available right now. So hard drives are the only thing that really that's not true on. But if you can't get 2 terabyte hard drives, you can put in a larger one and still just rebuild, ignore the larger space. But things like GPUs, node boards, and that kind of thing, Titan has been decommissioned, and we're actually getting some of the parts from Titan. I think they're parking servo racks that came out of Indiana's Big Red 2 are going to be parked in our transformer room to use as spare parts. So we will have an abundance of spare parts actually. So I'm not too worried about that either at the moment. So.
So one of the efforts that Blue Waters engaged in was working with commercial software vendors to help them expand make sure their code could expand to the size of a Blue Waters. And that's a very interesting exercise relative to what's going on with ECP and a variety of software development efforts there. How is that knowledge being shared? What is your, shall we say, estimation of the ability of an ANSYS or similar commercial software vendor to take advantage of exascale architectures, et cetera? Just some commentary on that.
That's an interesting question. That might even be a good segue for our next speaker. Brendan probably can talk about that even more intelligently than I can. We have worked with our industry program that Brendan represents and as our next speaker over the past 6 years, and have had a number of studies and allocations for companies to work on Blue Waters and to scale their code in Blue Waters. We have one right now that where companies got a small allocation for exactly that purpose. So we continue to offer that as a service. And then the work with ExxonMobil was an example of that, where they never did run production on our system, but we had a larger scale than they did. So they were able to prove out the scaling on our system before they could go back and make the case for a larger system in-house. We certainly have worked with ANSYS on Fluent and others throughout the history of Blue Waters, and a number of you'll find if you go through our archives, there are a number of press releases, say Cooke and others, working with ANSYS to produce, world records for their code running at scale on our system. So we have had a history of doing that sort of thing.
Well, Brett, I have one question, because it kind of your response triggered this. So you said there's lots of spare parts around and you can keep this going, but at the end of the day, in the field of supercomputing, in terms of software patches and security holes and all that, have you really looked into that and see how you can actually keep this going? Because
we are.
At some point, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
That is true. Where that point is, I'm not exactly sure. It's a matter of opinion, I guess. We do still get security patches, and so we still we are paying Cray and ultimately SUSE to backport any critical security-related issues into software patches that can be applied to our system. So we still get those. So we do take security very, very seriously. So if there's a critical security update, we still take short notice, within a day downtime is when we get the packages to actually deploy them on the system. So that part I'm not super worried about for, again, in the next year, but that is something we do take into account. And I have to say, we're not running the system this long necessarily because we really want to. We are looking at ways of replacing it as well. But
yeah, because there's the point of diminishing returns at some point.
Yeah. Certainly the power bill is rather expensive. So.
Okay. Very good. Thanks again, Brett.
Thank you.